6 more programs about small, historic English towns. And again, the choice was tantalizingly difficult. But one of the joys of these small towns is their unending variety. Origins, plans, development, siting, never the same in any 2 places. And then the traditional building materials, stone, brick, wood, plaster. They've always been a prime interest of mine, and they're bound to figure prominently in all these programs. The delight of travelling about in this country is that every few miles what I've called the pattern of English building changes. And that was lucky too, because we wanted to have towns that were well distributed geographically. And what better county to start in than Warwickshire, the hub of the English wheel, as it were, whose streams feed both the Bristol Channel and the Humber. So here we are in the ancient county town, Warwick. The medieval town must have been built almost entirely of wood, plaster, and thatch. And then in 1694, disaster struck. The first week in September, after a dry summer, was always a propitious time for fires. The Great Fire of London had burned from September the 3rd to the 6th. And then 28 years later, to the day, came the Great Fire of Warwick. It began here, at the Friends Meeting House, close to the West Gate. And fanned by a strong west wind, it spread quickly along High Street to the Cross. Then the wind changed direction, and Church Street, most of St. Mary's, and Northgate Street became enveloped. It was all over in a matter of hours. With a few exceptions, it was really only the buildings on the periphery that escaped. So that's where the timber framing is, and there's still quite a lot of it. Few of these houses have escaped restoration, but here in Mill Street, this range in particular makes a picturesque group. Here are some closer to the centre of the town, quite near the old cross, in fact. But the most pleasing example is this one, Thomas Oaken's house in Castle Street. Thomas Oaken was a well-to-do Elizabethan mercer who left all his property, including this house, to the town. Structurally, this is timber framing at its most satisfying, with those 2 magnificent curved braces echoed by smaller ones. There's also plenty to be seen just inside the West Gate. The fire started close to this point, but the wind was blowing the other way. Having escaped one fate, though, many of these buildings were later subjected to a strident black and white treatment, in an entirely unnecessary attempt to preserve them. The same was true of the Lord Leicester Hospital opposite. But in recent years, the whole exterior of this building has been de-blacked, to its great artistic benefit. The timbers have had a decidedly checkered career. It's odd, because oak, provided that it has a damp-proof base and an overhanging roof, a good hat and a good pair of shoes, as they used to say in Devon, will last for centuries, and in fact become still harder in the course of time. Harder even than some varieties of stone. It's not only the timbers that have had a checkered career. When they were first erected in the late 14th or early 15th century, the buildings were the headquarters of two medieval merchant guilds. But in 1571, the Earl of Leicester took over the premises as a hospital for aged and disabled soldiers. A hospital in those days meaning almshouses. Before they were blackened, these timbers were smothered with red ochre, and in the cloister walk, traces of this still survive. Adjoining the hospital on the right is the former Anchor Inn, another timber-framed building dating from before the fire. And behind this lies the malt house, which has a double jetty or overhang. It also has some of that rather busy infilling, with cusped circles and concave-sided diamonds, characteristic of timber framing in the Midland and Western counties. By the 1840s, perhaps because it was just an almshouse, the hospital had been allowed to fall into a very dilapidated state. The front of the master's house, the gabled building on the far side of the courtyard, is Victorian. This is, for the most part, a plaster sham, the black being painted on to look like timber. It's somewhat ironical, therefore, that this should be the part most photographed by unsuspecting visitors. The designer took his cue from the malt house, with a few additions. Since the Victorian period, I'm glad to say, we've learnt a good deal about restoration. All the same, black and white dies hard in Warwick. Moreover, much of the timber framing can only be described as facsimile replacement. Now, until the fire, everything in Warwick that wasn't timber, plaster or thatch was stone. There's plenty of stone here. Most of the town is built on it. Triassic sandstone. But unhappily, none of it is very good. It's an attractive stone when first quarried, but horribly friable. It just won't stand up to centuries of weathering. A good example of a local quarry is this one, within easy carting distance of the town. It isn't used anymore, but it could be. The stone was always decidedly on the soft side. While it retained what the masons called its quarry sap, it could be cut like cheese. This house is less than a mile from the quarry, which almost certainly supplied the stone for it. It was built in 1626 on the site of the medieval hospital of St. John, hence its name, St. John's House. Of the 5 gables, the 3 with curved sides are of the Dutch type, rather popular in the time of Charles I. The restoration of the stonework is of course an incessant expense, but the house, most of which is now a branch of the County Museum, is admirably maintained. Still pre-fire, the old market house, begun in 1670, now houses the main museum. The builder was a Warwickshire man, William Herbert. In 1935, believe it or not, the town council actually wanted to destroy this building. Now, I'm not saying that all here is entirely well. The condition of the stonework again isn't quite what one would wish. Furthermore, until 1879, the ground floor was open as the designer intended. Then it was filled in with windows which are visually a disaster. Here one longs for faster stone decay to provide an excuse for replacing them. What did happen in 1961 was that the cupola and dormers were put back. This improved the appearance of the building enormously. Far and away the largest and most imposing stone building here is, of course, the castle. Perched on a 50-foot high precipice, dropping sheer into the River Avon, this is one of the great sights of England. The castle, I need hardly say, is the kingpin of the Warwick story. Very strong both by nature and by art, as William Camden put it rather neatly in his Britannia of 1586. Its tremendous towers, its huge scale, its dramatic site, these features of the castle have fascinated artists of every generation, and not least Canaletto, whose 2 splendid paintings, done about 1749, are now in the City Art Gallery at Birmingham. This is the east front from the outer ward, and you can see quite clearly how the Barbican or outer gatehouse precedes the clock tower for additional defence. And here's the courtyard view of the east side. The castle is the first building in Warwick of which there's any record. It goes back to 915. But the towers, and indeed most of what we see today, were first built in the 14th century by the Beauchamps, earls of the second creation. The castle escaped the Great Fire, but had its own rather bad one in 1871. And largely because of this, certain parts now have an undeniably Victorian appearance. Inevitably, over the centuries, there's had to be a great deal of restoration. Not all of it very happy. I'm on the roof now. A puffy little climb, but well worth it. From here, there's a plunging view of the ruins of the old bridge. This bridge, a structure of 14 arches which went back to the Middle Ages, carried all the traffic coming into Warwick from the south. Climbing close beside the east wall of the castle, the road emerged at the cross, forming the central nub of the town. By 1789, this bridge was in a very bad state of repair. So bad, indeed, as to be unsafe. The Earl of Warwick saw his chance. If, he said, the people would agree to divert the road from Banbury some 250 yards upstream, he would defray 3/4 of the cost of the new bridge. It needed an Act of Parliament to get the scheme through. Warwick certainly did get a fine new bridge, but the Earl obtained an invaluable extension to his grounds. The castle and its park now monopolised the whole of Warwick's view of the Avon, even more than before. And the rerouting of the road caused the central crossroads to lose much of its former significance. The High Cross, which used to occupy the site, had been removed shortly after the Great Fire, when it was declared that henceforth all public streets and lanes should be of a convenient wideness. But the disappearance of this landmark had an unfortunate and unforeseen effect, since the unimpeded stretch running from the west gate to the east now acts as a magnet for absolutely incessant traffic. The east gate, by the way, like the west, marks the limits of the medieval walled town. The upper part was rather charmingly rebuilt in the Gothic manner in 1788. At its two ends, close to the gates, this long street has kept its Greek Doric pillar boxes. The first letter boxes were erected in England in 1853. And in the early days, the local authorities were given a considerable amount of freedom to produce their own designs. They weren't even always read. Not many, though, chose the classical style, but Warwick did, and this letterbox is a precious survivor. Another street which was widened in the rebuilding was Church Street, running northward from the cross. The view along it is dominated by the commanding presence of St. Mary's Tower, built of stone brought from Shrewley, 5 miles to the west. After the Great Fire, the tower had initially been rebuilt with stone quarried from the churchyard itself. The original architect sited it farther east, flush with the ends of the aisles. But when that tower had risen 29 feet above the nave roof, it developed alarming cracks and had to be dismantled. The new tower was built out into the road, and scenically this was a lucky accident, for from every direction this big tower, aslant to the axis of all the 3 streets converging on it, composes with the utmost felicity. Close to, though, some very odd features emerge. At the crown, crocketed pinnacles and little round arches are curiously juxtaposed. And below, there are repetitive niches on every face, many looking as though they would welcome the addition of a statue. It really is an odd stylistic hybrid. And because the tower had to be built out into the road used to run beneath it. The rebuilding was completed in 1704. This is what the Germans call a Hallenkirche, or hall church, a type of church not common in England, in which the aisles are the same height as the nave. So we do experience a great sense of space. The architect for the rebuilding was not Christopher Wren, who did submit plans, but William Wilson, born the son of a Leicester baker. The nave has many merits, but I'm bound to add that had Wren been the architect, I do not believe that he could conceivably have designed window tracery as ugly as this. A minor feature, which I find entirely delightful, is the clock, dated 1706. Not long ago, it was beautifully restored. Although the stalls were destroyed in the fire, happily the chancel survived. And so also did the feature for which this church is most celebrated, the Beauchamp Chapel, which dates from the middle of the 15th century. This is probably the most lavish memorial chapel in England outside Westminster and Windsor. In the centre is the tomb of Richard Beauchamp, guardian of Henry VI. The sculptures are of gilded brass. The material of the tomb chest, Purbeck marble. The effigy of Richard Beauchamp was modelled by William Austin of London, 15 years after the Earl's death, so it's probably not a portrait. But nonetheless, it's masterly, at once strong and elegant. Look at those wonderful hands. At his feet are a muzzled bear and a griffin, the bear being his badge and the griffin that of his wife. Beauchamp was certainly a man of action. He travelled to the Holy Land, defeated Owen Glendower in battle, was an English representative at the Council of Constance, and was also involved with the burning of Joan of Arc. In the canopied niches are 14 figures of weepers, clad in heavy mourning cloaks, and modelled with great sensibility, alternating with 18 rather mass-produced little angels. Among a great deal of other sculpture in this chapel, of varying quality, the little figures that frame the east window are unusual. There are no fewer than 30 of them, all under canopies. They surround the big window and run up both the principal mullions. Most of them are angels, but there are also 4 larger female saints, which, in their chocolate box colours, might almost have stepped out of one of those lovely Rococo churches in Bavaria. This one is St. Mary Magdalene. Tucked in between the Beauchamp Chapel and the chancel is the lovely little Dean's Chapel. This was inserted a few years after the Beauchamp Chapel had been completed. It has a fan vault with pendants and bosses recently regilded and blue spandrels. North of St Mary's runs what has been described as the finest 18th century street in the Midlands, Northgate Street. The old Shire Hall escaped the fire, and it wasn't rebuilt until the 1750s. The interior is especially notable for two octagonal courtrooms, rooms of great distinction. This is one of them, the Crown Court. I'm enjoying here a dock's eye view. It has all its original furnishings and is top lit. The eight-sided dome is adorned with stucco panels of two alternating designs. The columns are crowned with rich Corinthian capitals. If you have got to do a stretch, you could hardly have a more elegant point of departure. The Shire Hall suffered from such bad stone decay that since the last war the fronts have had to be completely refaced. This was done in Hollington stone from Staffordshire, which was the best, indeed almost the only, Triassic sandstone available. For a complete refacing it is satisfactory, but on the side wall of the old jail can be seen the unfortunate effect of patching Warwick stone with Hollington. This house, on the other side of the street, is similarly disfigured. A better example of restoration is the former courthouse, now the offices of the town council. This handsome building, finished in 1728, was by Francis Smith. He gave additional weight and authority to what is really a comparatively small building by repeating the pilasters at regular intervals and by rusticating the stonework horizontally, that is, by providing unusually deep joints between the blocks of masonry. Beneath an exuberantly carved coat of arms stands the stern figure of Justice, painted but actually cast in lead. The building greatly benefits from the restoration of Smith's original open balustrade, which in the 19th century had been replaced by a solid parapet. Francis Smith, Smith of Warwick, as he's often called, was twice mayor of this town, in 1713 and again in 1728. And that would have been where he sat. He's a good example of a phenomenon not uncommon in the 18th century, of a man of quite humble birth. He was the son of a bricklayer who started off as a mason and rose in the world. In middle age, like many of us, he put on quite a lot of weight. It was the fire of Warwick that gave him his great chance. He became a master builder and in all but name an architect, with a substantial country house practice all over the Midlands. He was no genius, but at best his work is very pleasing. This house in the marketplace was almost certainly his work, not only for stylistic reasons, but because it was built in 1714 for his father-in-law. After the fire, timber framing, and especially thatch, were absolutely taboo in Warwick. In some streets, in fact, any thatch which had escaped the fire had to be removed. So the choice here lay only between not very good stone and brick. Smith chose stone, with the result that in 1963 this house had to be completely refaced. The capitals on this next house, flat but fluted, are decidedly original. This is an early 18th century stone house which has so far escaped wholesale restoration. It offers an interesting study in windows. On the two main floors they are sash-framed, whereas the dormers have casements with leaded lights, a reminiscence of the 17th century when everyone's windows were like these. The thin, finely moulded glazing bars on the ground floor are an obvious renewal, perhaps about 1800. But on the first floor, the thick, flat bars are original. Glazing bars were nearly all like this when they first came in shortly before 1700. By comparison with that modest country cousin, this one, about a generation later, is brimming over with self-confidence. Just look at the delicate twin pilasters and the stylish capitals. And here the glazing bars of the windows are just right. The counterpoint between the smooth upper story and the bold rustication below is delightful. Still, it can't be denied that the local stone was extremely vulnerable to decay. And so more and more people in Warwick came to abandon stone for brick. Brick had indeed been used a little before the fire. This house, by Roger Hurlbut, who was probably the son or perhaps the nephew of the William who did the market house, was built in 1692. It's of brick, with only the dressings of stone. It has a good deal of wood, too, notably the boldly projecting modillion eaves cornice, typical of the later Stuart period. The original windows would have been casements. These, not at all satisfactory, were put in about a century later, probably by the parents of the poet and essayist Walter Savage Landor, who was born here and after whom the house, which is now part of a school, is named. This house could also have been just pre-fire. It's enjoyable, but unfortunately it's now divided. I do wish the two owners could agree on a common colour scheme. In their own interests, it would add scale and dignity to their property. And may I make a strong plea for white, which is far more telling in contrast with the brickwork. Northgate House, dated 1698, is an early and imposing post-fire example of brick. It was really built as two houses, the grandest semi-detached imaginable, with a shared carriage entrance in the centre. It may well have been put up as a speculation. Since it was 4 years after the fire, and there was now a big demand for bricks in Warwick, local brick kilns were set up, and there seems to have been quite an influx of itinerant labour. When first built early in the 18th century, these were regarded as amongst the most desirable private houses in Warwick. They're in Northgate Street, on the opposite side to the law courts. The pilasters between the houses are an interesting indication of post-fire nervousness, for they mask the ends of exceptionally thick party walls. It is a pity that most of the houses in this street were later stuccoed over, presumably early in the 19th century, when, even if you couldn't afford to have stone, it was fashionable to aspire to it. But here's a good example of a Georgian house which escaped the stucco. Here we have Warwick's brickwork at its best, set off by white-painted dressings. And as an extra bonus, there's still crown glass in almost all the windows. This hand-spun glass, virtually unobtainable for a century and more, harbours the most delightful glinting reflections. Warwick today, in the aftermath of the lamentable rearrangements of 1974, is in the anomalous situation of being no longer a borough, but instead part of a district council administered from Leamington. And yet, at the same time, it is still the county town of Warwickshire. William Camden said of this town, "It stands on a hill which is one entire rock of freestone, out of whose bowels were wrought all the public buildings that adorn it." Would that this were still the truth. But the county council, which has done some good work for Warwick, has put up a big building on a key site which is totally out of keeping. Just look how the strong horizontals cut across the verticals of the church tower, thus depriving the town of what used to be one of its most delightful views. If the new building had to look like this, it should have been far less conspicuously sited. All that we have left is the rich crown of the church tower, and even that disappears as we approach. It really is a tragedy. How different it all was in 1716, 22 years after the fire, when Daniel Defoe wrote, "Warwick is now rebuilt in so noble and beautiful a manner that few towns in England make so fine an appearance." Well, of some streets and buildings, even today, that is still largely true.